Chapter 20. Bought with a Price. Chase was the older guy that I met the day of the funeral, and now he was asking me out on a date. I declined a few times, but I spoke to Lizzie about him, and she told me that he would be able to help me with my kids. The thought of taking care of 4 children all alone simply terrified me, so I gave in to him. I had just turned 23, and he was 70. He did not look his age, but the huge age difference was very noticeable. We were the odd couple. Not only was he older, but he was also white. We got stares all the time, but I didn't mind them at all because I had become accustomed to being criticized. Chase took me places I had only dreamed of going. He gave me everything I thought I wanted. A bigger house, new car. He literally spoiled me. He wasn't my dream guy, but he grew on me. My family liked him too. I had some explaining to do, but it wasn't long before Grandma Dorothy accepted him. I even took him to meet Grandma Mattie, and she liked him too. He was a big man, and he was very resourceful. He had lived a full life with his wife, 2 boys, and grandchildren until his wife died. Now he was alone. He lived in a beautiful house in a suburb of St. Joseph, Missouri, that he had built himself from the ground up. There was a fishing lake and over 75 acres of land. I loved taking the children there to play. The only real problem in our relationship was me. I was bound by a lifestyle that wouldn't allow change, even in the midst of all the opportunities that were made available to me. I met a new running buddy, and her name was Kami. She and I would go dancing all the time. Nothing made me happier than dancing. I would dance everywhere I went, the club, the store, at home. I simply loved it. I was good enough to win contests sometimes. Kami introduced me to a man named Freddie. He only lived a few blocks away from our grandmother's house, so we kept pretty close in contact. We talked on the phone a lot. Then, when I went to his place, one thing led to another, and we had intercourse. I regretted it the instant it happened. I never went back again, and I avoided all of his calls. I wasn't even sure why I had gone to his place that night. I certainly did not think that I loved him. Without giving it any thought, I had given myself to a stranger. Today, I know that I did it because I didn't know my worth. I didn't know that girls all over the world were saying no and waiting for the mate that God had chosen and prepared for them. I didn't know that it was fornication, and I was defiling my body. How could I have known when this lifestyle had been displayed before me all of my life? I know there are others who don't know, young and old women who sell themselves short. They do not know that their worth is not measured by their looks, their figure, their education, or the length and texture of their hair. It is established and realized in Christ Jesus, the one who gave his life for us. Ladies, he bought us with his blood. That's how much we are worth. Our bodies are temples designed to be a dwelling place for the Spirit of Christ. Our bodies were never meant to be used and abused by anyone. I found out I was pregnant again. I wanted to shoot myself, but instead I told Chase. I knew he would be hurt, but he had always told me that he knew I had needs that he couldn't fulfill. We decided the best thing to do was get an abortion. He gave me the money, drove me to the clinic, and waited for me to come out. I had been deceived into thinking that an abortion was best, but in reality, it was the worst thing I could have done. It was a different kind of wrong. It was murder, and it was my own child. If I would have known back then what I know today, I would have never done it for anything in the world. I will regret it for the rest of my life. When we find ourselves overwhelmed with the troubles of this world and we feel like we have nowhere to turn and we've run out of options, abortion is never the answer. I took my own child's life a decision I made as if I were deciding what dress to wear to a dance. I didn't carefully consider it or seek out wise counsel, and now I can never take it back. So again, I tell my story to try to prevent someone else from making the same mistake. Over the years, I have met hundreds of women who have had abortions. At the time, they believed it was the best thing, like I did. Afterwards, they hated what they had done, and some consequently found themselves dealing with serious depression and addictions. I have never met anyone who said it didn't haunt them and they didn't regret it. What they said was if they had it to do over again, they wouldn't have made the decision to terminate their pregnancy, no matter what the cost. I continued to live my life haphazardly, and I pushed that sin to the back of my mind. I got 2 jobs, and I asked my little brother to come and live with me. He was not attending school, and he was getting into all sorts of mischief. It was my harsh desire to see that he graduated. I wanted to do that for my mother. He moved in, and I enrolled him in school. I bought all of his clothes, and he watched the children while I worked. I believed that things were finally working out. He was good with the children, and he kept the house clean when I was away. I always kept a clean house, so I would leave strict instructions, and he would follow them. I made sure he had the beer he wanted for the day, so he would be content. I didn't automatically think that my brother was an alcoholic, but he was, and I had been giving him the poison that was keeping him sick. I would later live to regret that also. I continued to look for love in all the wrong places, and my list of unhealthy relationships continued to grow. Kami introduced me to yet another man. His name was Damon Cones. He was a real smooth talker. I was drawn to him. The Bible calls people you feel that kind of connection to familiar spirits. I was full of the devil by this time. Damon's fast talking and my mentality went hand in hand. We would go to the clubs frequently because he liked to dance, almost as much as I did. We would end up fighting most every time. Then we would break up, get back together, and repeat the same pattern over again. My relationship with Damon lasted about 18 months, but there was a lot that happened during that time. We lived life in the fast lane, and none of us were prepared for the consequences that came along with that. It was a rare occasion when I didn't want to go out to the club, but there came a night that I did not want to go. I can't explain it. I just intuitively knew that I wasn't supposed to go out that night. After much coaxing from Damon, I went against my gut feelings. We made stops at all the usual places, and I remember telling Damon at every stop that I wanted to go home. We decided to make one last stop at a club on 31st Street. Harry, Damon's brother, was the driver, so it was pretty much up to him. Damon and I went in to check out the scene. I didn't want to stay, so I asked Damon to at least ride with me while Harry took me home. As I walked out the door, there were all kinds of youngsters outside. It was an atmosphere that I was never comfortable in, and understandably so, considering the events that took place next. Someone grabbed my arm and was trying to pull me close. He said, "Hey girl, come here." Damon was behind me, and he told him to take his hands off me. As we were approaching the car, they started arguing. I told Damon to get in the car, but the guy punched Damon. Then a swarm of guys surrounded him and started hitting and kicking him. I was having flashbacks of the tragic night that Devin was killed, and I knew I had to help him. I began punching the guy that was on top of him. Then someone hit me so hard that it knocked me off my feet. Out of nowhere, Damon's brother, Cedric, helped me up and put me in the back seat of the car. He grabbed Damon and quickly threw him in the front passenger seat. Then he got in the driver's seat and drove off. We all started wondering where Harry was, and we came to the conclusion that he had taken off. It made absolutely no sense to me that he would get out of his own vehicle and leave. We had no other explanation. Damon and I were in pretty bad shape, so we drove straight to the hospital. Damon's jaw was broken, and there was blood everywhere. Upon arrival, I was diagnosed with having a fractured tailbone. Damon was admitted and had to stay in the hospital for a few days. His mouth was wired shut, and he could have nothing but liquids. We tried to contact Harry for about a week, then we stopped trying. We figured he didn't want to talk to us. After about 2 weeks, we got information on what really happened to Harry that night. He had gotten out of the car to help Damon, and a gang of guys dragged him down the street and beat him so bad that he was in a coma. We rushed to the hospital to see him. His wife was very angry, and she didn't want us to see him, so we had to sneak in. We were shocked to learn that he had severe brain damage. I don't think he even knew who we were. He was sitting up in a wheelchair, and his eyes were open, but he was not the Harry we knew and loved. When the visit was over, I promised to go back and see him. I kissed him on the forehead, told him I loved him, and left. I wasn't able to keep that promise because Harry took a turn for the worse and died a few days later. If I would have known that I was visiting him for the last time, I would have spent more time and said more, even if he didn't understand. I didn't attend the funeral because I felt responsible for his death. I knew his wife would be angry, and the guilt was consuming me. I couldn't find the words to tell his wife how sorry I was. I went into severe depression and started using cocaine again. Damon had a friend named Fred who was always warning me that Damon wasn't the person I thought he was. I had a hard time understanding why a grown man would take another grown man nearly everywhere he went. I had nothing against Fred personally, but I saw it as a lack of maturity on Damon's part. The time came when I found out why Fred had been telling me that Damon was not the man I thought he was. The two of them left one evening with a woman named Nadia. She would pick Fred up and Damon would always tag along. I spoke to her each time she came, but that particular day when I invited her in, she would not accept my invitation. The three of them left. An hour or two later, Fred returned without Damon. That's when I was able to put it together. Nadia had been coming for Damon all along. Fred was a decoy and an accessory to the crime. When Damon came home, I told him to get his things and leave. He made Fred leave because he refused to lie to me any longer. Damon went to stay with his mother. At least that's what he told me. A few weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant again. I know this sounds crazy. It was around the tables of NA that I learned their definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I was, without a doubt, insane. After careful consideration and a heavy dose of guilt from the last abortion, I decided to keep my baby. Now, the task was figuring out how to stay clean during the pregnancy. The only thing I knew to do was get out of the environment. I decided to go and stay with Chase, so I went to St. Joseph. Karina was pregnant with her first child, and she thought it would be a good idea to get out of town too. Chase gave me money for an abortion, and I spent it on drugs. We got high for what we stated would be our last time. Chase was good to us. The children had everything they needed, and everything that he did for me, he did for Karina too. I didn't tell Chase that I hadn't gotten the abortion. From time to time, he would just say, "Hun, that baby's still in your belly, isn't it?" And I would say, "No, I'm just bloated," and he wouldn't say any more. My belly continued to grow, and finally, at around 6 months, I could no longer deny that I was still pregnant. Chase was crushed. There was nothing that I could say to make the situation better, so I didn't say anything. I had done the best I could to have a healthy baby. I was 24, having my 5th child, and I was lost. When it came time for me to deliver, we all went home to prepare for her arrival. The move back was a trigger for me, and 3 days before my baby was born, I relapsed and used drugs again. They tested for drugs due to my history. There was no drugs in my baby's system, but they found them in mine. It seemed God had shown up again. I knew that I had a problem, but I didn't know how to solve it. I thought I was a good mother. People in my circle actually called me the ideal mother. But today, I realize that even if I hadn't been on drugs and I gave them the best of everything, they still would not have received what was most important, a mother who had a relationship with Jesus Christ and could train them up in the way. When I left the hospital, the caseworker came to do an assessment. She was impressed with my home and my children. She told me what was expected of me, and she gave me her card. As soon as I was physically able, I went back to work. I was offered a job doing private duty nursing. My client's name was Joseph Regulia. We called him Pappy. He was a 95-year-old man, and he was a true man of God. I knew right away that I was going to love working for him. I worked 3 to 4 days a week, overnight. The pay was decent, and the work was very rewarding. Although Mr. Regulia talked about God, I didn't understand the concept of him being a holy man and wanting to do nothing but live for Jesus. One evening, I was on the telephone with my brother Mallet, and I said some things in anger that I shouldn't have. I didn't know Pappy was listening. He told me to have a seat. Then he quoted the scripture to me from Psalms 34:12 and 13. What man is he who desires life and loves many days, that he may see God? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking guile. I apologized, and I was careful not to speak any words of guile in his house again. Pappy was holy in every way. I loved being in his presence because I knew that I was in the presence of God. No earthly words could describe him. He was mystical and peculiar. His conversation was always of heaven and godly things. He was committed to God. I saw it, I felt it, and I was mesmerized by it. I didn't know it at the time, but his daily walk spoke louder to me than any sermon. I couldn't describe it, but he was no ordinary man. His character was of someone that was not of this world. At mealtime, I'd walk him into the kitchen where we'd sit at the small table near the window that gave us a beautiful view of the backyard. I would listen as he spoke the oracles of God. I had never noticed how marvelous God's creation was. It was Pappy that showed me the beauty of the birds, trees, and the sky. This man that I had only known for a short time and had very little knowledge of was touching my life in a profound way. He showed me strength and dedication in all that he did. He'd been a train conductor all of his life, and he spent his days telling people about Jesus as they boarded the train. Yet he refused to eat at times because he had not worked that day. He'd say, "No work, no eat." He modestly refused to eat food that was purchased with the money that he'd worked for all of his life. I had to come up with a plan to get him to eat. He couldn't do any real work at his age. His legs were weak and feeble. At dinner time, I would have him wipe the kitchen table right there in his seat and dry a plate or two. Then I would assure him that he had worked and was now worthy of the meal placed before him. It was easy to please Pappy. He didn't complain and he never fussed. Somehow, working there gave me the strength to stay clean. I even thought about Pappy when I went home. I would call him just to hear him speak the word of God. I had no understanding of what was happening. I didn't know it was the word of God, but I was drawn to it. Still, I continued to look for love in all the wrong places. I found myself in another relationship. This individual was the brother of a friend. I didn't take it slow. I dove right in, and things got bad quickly. When I reconnected with an old friend, she reminded me that she had dated him. I had totally forgotten that there was a history between them, but it was all coming back to me. I was able to remember the stories about what he had done several years prior. He was dating an older woman, and the two of them were at an area park in Kansas City. An argument broke out between them, and he beat her to death. I don't know what they fought about. I was told it was drug-related. The more I remembered, the more I realized I had to get out of that relationship. I couldn't believe that he was capable of such a heinous crime. There were so many pluses. He'd cooked, cleaned, babysat, fixed my car, kept it full of gas, and every payday he brought his entire paycheck home to me. He never gave me any trouble where Chase was concerned. He accepted my relationship with him. I thought I had it made. When the time came for me to break it off with him, he was very hurt. He literally begged me to give him another chance. When I refused, he left without giving me any trouble. Several months later, that man murdered yet another woman and was sentenced to 75 years in prison. That could have been me. It's almost too much for me to believe, and I lived it. I tell you, Jesus is real, and he has been good to me. The guilt that was consuming me told me that death was a suitable punishment, and it should have been me. But God thought differently. The storms just kept on coming. Pappy became ill, and none of us knew what was wrong with him. I watched him suffer in a way that was foreign to me. Instead of moaning and groaning, he simply held my hand and sang, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus, sweetest name I know. Here's my every longing, keeps me singing as I go." These words were so amazing to me. This man was in excruciating pain, yet he didn't complain. He only sang praises to his Lord. Getting out of bed was not an option for Pappy. He was in too much pain. After 2 days of watching Pappy suffer, I called an ambulance. I didn't go to the hospital with Pappy. We said our goodbyes right there in that bedroom. I told him that I loved him, and I knew he felt the same about me. When the paramedics told me that he would be okay, I nodded and gave no reply. I knew in my heart that Pappy was not going to be okay. That was the last time I saw Pappy alive. I called his family, told them what I had done, then packed my things. I was sure that I would be fired for making such a call without permission. Later that evening, I received a call from one of Pappy's sons. He told me that Pappy had passed away just hours after being at the hospital. The doctors determined the cause of death was pneumonia. His son thanked me for making the call and told me that I had done the right thing. I walked around with the pain in my heart that could not be explained. There was such a great sense of loss. Pappy's funeral was awesome. His eulogy confirmed for me what I already believed in my heart. Jesus was in Pappy. He had lived a life that was to be commended. As a lifelong conductor for the railroad, he always greeted his passengers the same way. He'd say, "All aboard?" And as they boarded the train, he would give them all a lifesaver. To the children, he gave of himself with a short story about Jesus, the true lifesaver. His love was unconditional, and he was no doubt one of God's chosen. I didn't know much about God, but I knew this man was from God. His family praised him for the contribution he had made to their lives and the lives of others. The things they said sounded like nothing short of a fairy tale, and somehow I knew my meeting him was no coincidence. I still wondered why I had been so privileged. The list of his many attributes went on and on. There was no doubt in my mind that Pappy was in heaven. Pappy's death hit me really hard. I cried for weeks and weeks. I know now that I was longing for the presence of the Lord, and because I had no coping skills, I resorted back to what I knew: drugs.